You're muted.
Do we want to redo that whole bit of the conversation?
I am sorry.
Let me give you
hey, Chase, thanks, and I'm just going to ignore what you said.
Real quickly, time, the way time is treated in the short story seems to be very subjective. So sometimes it seems like time is expanding, and other times it seems like time is very constricted. And I thought that was interesting because remember Albert's question to the Chinese, excuse me, the Japanese spy, or Chinese spy, begging your pardon, what is in a story whose answer is chess, what is the one prohibited word? And it was chess, but
chess.
Then Albert brings up time.
Yeah,
right,
it's interesting. Go ahead, Sean. You can go.
I was just going to say, like, although, like, I mean, so, because I think that's explicitly, like, being presented as, like, the thing that's prohibited in a riddle, but, that's not necessary in Evid, but,
yeah.
also, I mean, since we're not, because I'm pretty sure he's Chinese. I could be wrong.
Yes, I apologize. I said Japanese initially. He's Chinese because it was his relative. Begging your pardon.
Yeah, I was sort of, I didn't remember if it was like explicitly stated. I'm never certain if I can tell, but like I feel like Japanese names and Chinese names are like very subtly different. But like if you were asking me like what the difference is, I couldn't tell you what it is. So when I read them, I was like, these sound like Chinese names. But like if you ask me why I think that, I have no idea.
Well, as a general rule, Chinese names are just are smaller set of words where. Right, Sun Yat-sen, Mao Zedong, but then, Tanaka. I mean, it's just like one longer last name at least.
Okay, that makes sense. And also, I don't know if we've stated since the recording started, but this is the Garden of Forking Paths. So this is in Labyrinths. So yeah, I mean, because it is interesting, right? Because if we're interpreting this as a riddle, like if we're doing that sort of meta-analysis of the story, then the fact that it brings up time sort of precludes that from being the answer to the riddle. But it also, I mean, it definitely, like this, when you're talking about like temporal modification, I mean, a lot of that seems to be happening in terms of, yeah, like sometimes things slow down, sometimes things speed up, and sometimes it feels like events happen like, far too quickly or far too loosely.
One thing, of going by the whole, if this is a riddle that cannot say what it's about, one possible solution that would be possibly the ethics of choice. Because that seems to be a kind of thing that it's kind of floating around but never talks about, in the sense that I think it's possibly saying that the way that you view time kind of alters or affects the way that you make choices that flow through time. And so he talks about that. I think it's somewhat towards the end where he talks, or somewhere in the middle maybe, but he talks about that for someone to do some kind of dastardly deed, they have to presume that it's inevitable. They have to tell themselves that in order to finish this. And yet he's kind of presented with this view of time that does make it inevitable in a sense. So he goes and, it's the whole, the labyrinth of the book of his ancestor that's basically saying that all things that could possibly happen do happen. And it's given the sense as a text, as a narrative that where, all possible narratives are not excluded for, just one actuality, but coexist in some sense as co-presence. And that, in a way, I think if you believe that, you would say, well, then whatever I do is going to happen, therefore it's inevitable, therefore I can pretty much do whatever because I'm going to do whatever no matter what. So in a way, I think you could possibly see it as that, like the real labyrinth is making choices. The real labyrinth, is trying to decide, like, how do I why do I do these things rather than these things? If this is inevitable, then what can I do to alter it? If I can I alter it? So and I think there's this idea of of fate in it, in the sense that it starts off. This guy is the German spy is captured, and he sees his own death as inevitable, and it's kind of ultimately all these forking paths are going to converge in his own death, which then kind of reminds me also of Heidegger's being towards death, that only in the light of our own temporal end does our actual life have meaning for us, knowing that it'll end in some way, kind of retroactively reflects some kind of meaning about time, in the same sense that if I believe that the world is going to end tomorrow, that's going to change my behavior. That's going to change the meaning of my own life in that next day, and even the whole narrative of my life in the past. So I think that's possible one way to see it, because I don't think it's necessarily giving a philosophical account of time and saying like, this is what time actually is. Everything is actually co-present and multiple universes. I think that's an interesting way to go, which I think we should discuss, but I think it's something a little more than that, that he's not just giving like a positive account of time and multiple universes or whatnot, but he's presenting it as a riddle, kind of. So yeah.
Well, what's interesting, think of how many times it seems like Borges likes to play around with the symbol of labyrinth. Well, it's a labyrinth. When we usually think the word labyrinth, we're like, oh crap, it's a maze. But that's from the point of view of a person who starts walking in it. If you have a much higher viewpoint, you see the design. Every labyrinth has a plan. So what's interesting to me is in that metaphor of the labyrinth, you have both confusion and uncertainty for the people who are in it, but at the same time, you pull back bigger and you actually say, oh, well, here's the different paths, here's the dead ends, here's the center, and all that. So I agree with you, Chase, that I don't think necessarily Borges comes to a conclusion, but I do think this story is a story about alternatives, options, decisions, and time and history, right? I mean, what is history but a certain series of decisions that people face with options that then choose, and then those choices seem to preclude some future actions and open up others.
Yeah, Chase, I somehow managed to miss that, but that's an interesting interpretation, because it makes me wonder if this is maybe a way of exploring determinism without having to cast it in terms of either a theological determinism or let's say scientific determinism, like some sort of materialistic thing. And the reason I say that, because it's not the same thing as determinism, but if you think about, a deterministic view would be, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. There's not a lot, I can't do anything about it. I'm just playing out this game. And then if you say, if you take the sort of mind mental experiment and say, well, there's an infinite, every possible thing that could be done will be done, it has a similar effect, that I am one of these paths, and I am, if every possible action is in some sense already out there, then every version of me is going to do every possible choice. Means in some sense there is no choice. And so, so then what is choice? Does choice have a meaning? Does choice have a moral meaning? Does choice have an existential meaning in terms of, directing to what degree do I have control over my own life? So that's interesting. And maybe it's at least partially a new alternative way of thinking about the limitations of free choice.
So I think one way to kind of play off that is so let's assume that this means that many worlds interpretation of quantum physics is, or any kind of a multiverse theory is real, in the sense that all of these. So although I don't think, I guess we can go into this. Maybe this is a bifurcating path of my own thought as I'm just saying this right now, but because I just kind of realized this, that I think what he's saying is with this book is that these things coexist in the same world in some contradictory sense, where normally we'd think of a many worlds interpretation as all possibilities coexist in different worlds, many worlds, but he's saying somehow that they coexist in one world, which I think you could possibly see it as, I'm going to try not to bring too much Deleuze into this, but, the idea of the virtual is like all these different possibilities, potentialities of the past and the future kind of coexist with the actual here in the present, and that they have this reciprocal relationship. And he actually references this story to show kind of something that's similar to Leibniz's idea of, the best of all possible worlds, to kind of show an inverted form of that. And he likes it because it shows that there's actually a kind of co-presence, a real that's co-present with the actual possibility or the actual manifestation in the present of a certain series in time. So I think that's another interesting way to look at it. And maybe we can go into that time stuff. Sorry for the bifurcation here, but to actually go into what I was going to say is, okay, so if there's like a multiple worlds or multiple choices somehow that you can go down, but then all of them are going to happen somehow, then that is, in a certain sense, deterministic, in the sense that whatever you could possibly do, you're going to do it. So, but then does that necessarily mean that you should do that? Because whatever you're going to do, that's the path that you're going to go down, even if in some other world, another version of you is going to do something else. Can't you still choose, though, which path you actually go down, in the sense that your fractured eye going through the series of time is going to go through the one that you choose? Whether you kill the person or not, you're still choosing which path you go down, even if on some level of the real, whatever you don't choose is also going to happen. So it's kind of like an attenuated form of free will or determinism. Of it kind of encapsulates both in a sense. So hopefully you guys can make some sense out of all that.
Well, no. You always bring up really interesting ideas, Chase. And that's why I always take notes when I'm in the seminars for you and the others, and try to write down whose name it was who said it, and then look at it and say, did I capture one half of it? To me, what's odd about this story is it appears to accept, or at least the two main people, the Albert and the Chinese spy, accept parallel universes, right? That there are multiple, garden of forking paths. There are possibilities here, and yet what's strange to me is a sense of determinism. I mean, in the face of these parallel universes, it seems to me that events stay the same, and the only thing that is altered is how they are perceived. I mean, what if Albert hadn't very quickly greeted the spy and then have that conversation? I mean, my sense is once the spy got on the train to go to Albert's house, there was going to be him pulling the trigger. Because remember, in what was very odd too is the writing said that Albert seemed to help him because he turned his back to him, right? And so it made it easier for him to shoot and kill him because he wasn't looking at him in the face, in the eyes. And so, you know, it seems to me that the perception can be how people perceive something that has happened can literally create, it almost seems like a different interpretation and a different fact, because you can tell that the Chinese spy is not happy. I mean, his final words in this short story are not in any way exultant, right? But what if he hadn't had that conversation with Albert? How would he be responding to what he had done? Would he have been more matter of fact? Would he have said, well, I have a job to do and it's a shitty job, but that's what I signed on for? But he feels, to me, he doesn't feel bad that he murdered someone. He feels very badly that he killed Albert, who had somehow been able to penetrate through time and physical distance this secret. And what made it worse is it was a secret about this spy's relative, his ancestor, which in China, ancestry would be very, very important. Was he almost killing his ancestor? What was he somehow maiming, damaging his ancestor? Because the one man who understood what his ancestor was trying to do to make sense of his ancestor's life, and he put a bullet in him.
Yeah, there's so much to this story that I kind of got these hints at her. It's kind of like you see kind of a depth there, but it was hard to even articulate to myself exactly what was going on. So I saw, you know, all these things are intentional, and then I think that's a really good point with the whole fact that it's this whole situation that he's in the story, in the sense that he has to do this thing that he himself kind of admits is absurd, in the sense that he's helping Germany, that a country he does not like, for kind of silly reasons, you know, to like prove like something about himself as a Chinese person to this German guy is the whole reason he's doing all this stuff. Seems kind of strange. And then the fact that he, on this, you know, quest to do this act, he then encounters this person that is an expert on his ancestry, and also has his view of time and whatnot that perfectly coordinates with the choice that he's about to do or make. And still he does it as if it's an inevitability. It's like, I can't even really articulate like what it means. It just I don't know. It's there's so much depth to it, but I can't even quite figure it out. But so one thing I'll say is one kind of synopsis that I've read was saying that he possibly turned his back, the Albert guy, to get his own gun because he knew himself that he was about to be shot, and you know, in one reality or another, that he was going to be shot, so he might as well defend himself. That's what he was trying to do, Albert. So, you know, it's kind of, I think also that he brings up chess at the beginning, and also he brings it up in Pierre Menard, you know, the author. He brings up the idea of chess also quite a bit. I think there's something like that going on with this, that there was a kind of because well, he talks about it also in the sense of, you know, the guy who's chasing him, the British military officer.
Madden.
This is, yeah, Madden. This is also a game, and you know he presents it as a kind of chess. And in the same way, there's something similar also going on with Albert, and it's just complicated by this view of time. And this is that, like, oh wait, all these things are going to happen, but what do I do knowing that? It's, yeah, I don't even know what to make of it, but yeah.
Well, thank you for bringing up chess, because I think that is an interesting point. Because you're right, in Pierre Menard, he does bring up the Menard plays around with a variation. And when I think of chess, and I'm think about it, it's certainly finite, right? There's a certain number of squares, a certain number of pieces, a certain number of rules about how each piece can move. But in some ways, isn't there almost an infinite variety of games of chess, that even if you start out with the first move, it starts branching off? And so from the first simple move of a pawn or of a knight, it just branch and branch and branch and branch. And what I read about chess masters is if you just randomly put chess pieces on a board, they won't remember it at all. But if the moves are actually the consequence of a series of legitimate chess moves, they recognize it more readily, and they can remember it better. And you know, I have a concept of do you ever hear the term oh God, I'm misremembering it, but levels of infinity, orders of infinity, that's the word I'm thinking of, orders of infinity. And it seems to me that Borges likes to play around with how can the finite be the basis for infinity? How can those two things coexist at the same time?
So I could definitely say something about that, but I know Sean wanted to say something.
Sorry. I think chess is an interesting one, and I wanted to sort of pile in on that because I think that it fits into the certain aspects of the story in some nice and symmetrical ways. One thing about chess, right? Presuming you have like two high skill people playing, at a certain point in the game, the conclusion is inevitable, right? Because the game sort of simplifies enough that people will make the right set of moves that will lead to a particular conclusion of a particular checkmate. So it seems to me, right, like if you have if you're talking about like in this particular story, right, if you have like sort of an inciting incident that results in a certain conclusion being inevitable, right, and there might be a few different routes to reach that inevitability in a particular chess game. So it might be that like, okay, at this point it's pretty much inevitable that white's going to be checkmated. But like there might be several routes at which you could reach that checkmate. There's a bunch of different choices that they could make, and it might occur earlier or later, or at about the same point, but just in a different sort of way. You know, the other interesting thing I think about it is the fact that there basically are only three outcomes with a chess match, assuming you play it to completion, right? You're either going to check black, you're going to check white, or you're going to have a stalemate. Those are your three options. There are only three possible conclusions to it. So even though hypothetically, right, I don't know if it's an infinite number, certainly at the very least, there's a ridiculously large number of like possible game configurations. I guess if you just moved pieces randomly, then you could indefinitely continue the game. So definitely, at least in that sense, there's an infinite number of chess games. But all of those infinite varieties have to siphon down to at a minimum three possibilities. They're either the game ends with a check on black, a check on white, or a checkmate on black, checkmate on white, or a stalemate. I think that this is interesting in terms of so the story that Albert tells about so we're told about an army that fights a battle on a mountain, and they win, and then they say, okay, well, the mountain hardened us and that's why we won the battle. And then, right, there's, okay, the army goes, it's the same army, and they fight a battle, and it's like in the middle of a place where there's a huge festival going on, and they say like the sort of enlivenment of the battle, or excuse me, of the festival, right? Like the energy that it gave us is what allowed us to win. And so one thing that I think it's pointing to there, apart from this question that we've been dealing with in terms of the many worlds interpretation, is just a plain old sort of meditation on a kind of, or maybe not necessarily determinism, but a kind of fatalism, right? So there's an inevitable outcome. And yeah, there's a bunch of different routes by which that outcome could have been reached. But what's interesting is that we use facts about how we reached that that fatalistic conclusion to sort of like tell the story about a deterministic result, that somehow all of these different factors led into a particular result. Whereas it could just be that like that was an incidental, that didn't actually have anything to do with resulting in the particular conclusion, right? And in a lot of ways, right, I mean, we could say that the conclusion of the story, I mean, we were sort of told it from the beginning, or at least it was implied that, okay, so you have the spy is going to go, he's going to try and send off this message. It's going to have something to do with, you know, causing some sort of problem for the British military. And right, the spy thinks that he's going to be captured, and he is captured, and he thinks he's going to be successful, and he is successful. So everything else that we were told in the story, you know, we could try to pluck at it and start telling a story about how it led to the conclusion, but it might all just be superfluous. It might not have anything to do with the particular conclusion that resulted. It might have shifted it around a little bit, but that's not much.
Well, the phrase I was trying to use and that I came up with some years ago, bear with me, practical infinity. What I mean is, obviously, the number of grains of sand that exists on Earth is a finite amount, but I don't think any group of human beings are literally going to count every single one of them. So when it comes to human agency, right, when it comes to our ability, because we are temporal beings, we are carbon-based life forms, we are faced with practical infinity. And that's what I think, in some ways, that's why I think there's recurring themes in Borges, right, of time, of choice. He goes back to this all the time, because wouldn't it be great if we knew everything? Then maybe all of our lives would be way more successful, however one defines success. But it's the contingency and the accidental nature of human life that makes it so interesting and wonderful and terrifying at the same time. But what I think is so interesting about this story is this a spy story? Would you tell a friend that this is a spy story? Or would you say it's something else? And that's what I think is so fun about Borges. It starts out very dryly misidentifying a British historian's work, you know, and you think, oh, okay, spy story, right? And then there's just a huge chunk of it that really has nothing to do with spying, with World War I, with anything.
Another sort of riffing off something Chase said, I may just be reinterpreting what you said in different words, I'm not sure, but you know, a question that I had in these three stories was the same question I had in the first story. Is he just describing our world? You know, is this just another way of describing actually what's happening now here? And so what Chase was saying made me think of it, that, you know, from my perspective, I have probably an infinite number of choices if you think about all the little minute possibilities, but I either have an infinite number or a near infinite, you know, a huge number of choices. And so, but I'm going to make a choice. Well, conceptually, that seems to be, you know, no different than they're actually the number of branching possibilities and me choosing this one. You know what I mean? I mean, because if there are an infinite number of possibilities and my choice is going to take me down this one, well, the only experience I have is this going down this one. And if there are other cells that are running down all these other paths, I'm not going to have any experience or knowledge of that. So you know, maybe this could, he may just be describing the world I am in. And so then again, sort of as Chase was suggesting, maybe this is a way of trying to probe certain features of what choice really is. That my actual choice is, from my subjective point of view, indistinguishable. So my dissertation advisor made this distinction between epistemological chance and metaphysical chance. And so metaphysical chance would be like, there really is real indeterminacy in the whatever the world is. And epistemological chance is, even if the world is completely deterministic, because I'm not omnipotent, I don't know all the possibilities. And so even if there are if there's a defined path, the fact that I don't know it means that my perception of choice is infinite. And, maybe this is a way of saying there's really no difference, in terms of actually making choices, because if there's metaphysically an infinite number of choices, like there are just, infinite worlds, but I'm going to actually go down this one. Maybe there's no difference between that and just being this world. And I don't have any knowledge of what my choices, the implications of my choice is going to be.
What was the second type of chance? What was the term, Nevitt?
Metaphysical and epistemological.
Epistemological, thank you.
Yeah, so metaphysical has to do with the being or nature of things, and epistemological has to do with knowledge.
Right.
Welcome, Daniel.
Hi.
Hi.
To be the annoying one here, how do we want to switch to another story, or do we want to keep chasing down this path, or what do we want?
So there's a few things I wanted to say more about the comments other people made about this story that I think segue very well into the next story, given that we're talking about, from choice to chance, which, that's what the lottery in Babylon is all about. So let's see. So first of all, the idea that Sean came up with about the kind of the inevitability of some kind of a conclusion all converging into, certain determinate conclusions, basically some kind of a checkmate. I think that makes the story make a lot more sense, in the sense that he's constantly talking about like this, I can't remember his name, British guy.
Madden.
Madden. Okay. I don't know why I can't remember that, but
he's actually
I definitely
Irish, remember.
Oh yeah.
That's the doubling, where you have a Chinese spy working for the Germans and an Irishman in the British spy system.
That is interesting. So I think it's one way, like there's a lot of bifurcating like checkmates going on, in the sense that either they bomb the city or they don't. Either he captures him in time or they don't. Either he shoots Albert or Albert shoots him. And so there seems to be some kind of like a checkmate ultimately, but then there's, a seemingly infinite amount of ways that could have come to one checkmate or the other. So I think it's interesting, and I think it also kind of goes against somewhat the idea that that it's a many worlds interpretation, because those many worlds, they branch out and they're done. But I think he wants to point out, and Deleuze points this out also about the story, that these paths kind of, they branch out, they bifurcate, but at times they also converge back into each other. So there's almost kind of like a fluctuation, which also could kind of possibly tie back into that kind of sense of like a rhythm, or like a contraction of duration that is kind of evident in the story. So I think that's really interesting. And then also the idea, this what keeps coming up is this idea of infinite infinities, or especially the infinite and the finite. Because he constantly uses, this story of, Zeno's paradox of, you have something finite, some finite distance or time or some kind of spatialized time, which Bergson absolutely hates, but I think Borges likes to play around with the idea, not necessarily because he believes, he's not like a Zeno disciple or something like that, but so he pointed this out, in this story of a kind of possible infinite bifurcation that also happens with like a seemingly finite determination of choices at the same time. So I think it's actually, so in The Lottery in Babylon, he talks about, so, there's this lottery, they apparently, they choose all these things, they have all these drawings, and one thing they say, well, it doesn't make sense to have just simply one drawing for one thing. That one drawing then leads to more drawings to determine how that is actually going to be implemented, which leads to more drawings, and eventually you have an infinite series of drawings for one thing. And he says basically, this seems impossible unless you understand basically Zeno's paradox that there can be an infinite subdivision in a finite series. So I think that's interesting, but I think, once again, we shouldn't take this to be that he's just saying that, that he's Zeno's disciple and that, infinite series can happen in, finite time spans. But I think a lot of what he's really trying to do with this theme is to show that there's actual paradoxes and limitations to the way that we actually think analytically. And that, one way of presenting Zeno's paradox is that it doesn't prove that, motion is impossible or something like that. It proves that basically the mind can't grasp reality, that the mind actually is a limited tool, that ultimately it doesn't actually mesh with our experience of reality, and that there's this disjunct. And I think he's interested in exploring this disjunct, where I think Bergson would say this disjunct, there's one way you can say either like Plato did, okay, there's our experience that shows, change and motion and becoming, and then there's our logic that is static and eternal, and there's a disjunct there. Plato and most of the Greeks, except probably Heraclitus, are going to say logic wins. Logic is actually the correct thing. That's the true reality. And then I think Bergson, he would say the opposite. He would say, actually our experience of this flow is the more real reality, and then logic is just something that kind of works within that but isn't totalizing. I think Borges wants to say that both are actually flawed, that neither of them actually really works out. And that's what he's constantly exploring is, these disjuncts, these paradoxes. And so I guess one of the last thing I would say is, has anyone here seen the film Mr. Nobody? Because I think that explores this idea very well about choices and about many worlds and whatnot. I'm not going to go into explaining all of it, but I'll just say it's a very good film also. So I would just recommend it in general. I'll take that as a segue into Lottery in Babylon. So yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking we should make that shift. I mentioned this before, I think, but I had a instructor once who said that the discovery of irrational numbers was the origin of tragedy in the Greek culture. And if you think about Plato, the domain of the forms is a domain of pure rationality. And so then you can ask the question, is there a form of the irrational for irrational numbers, since they are fundamentally irrational? So that's, and so like you said, maybe Bergson is playing around with that. And I, just sort of hitting this same note I've been hitting for 2 weeks, is the world he's describing our world. At the very end of this story on the Lottery of Babylon, he's like, well, maybe there, some people say there is no company. And so, that makes me think again, like you said, maybe he's just saying this is really what's happening. Or like you say, just a way of examining our reality.
So,
Can
I'll just say, Pythagoras, apparently some of Pythagoras' disciples murdered one of the people that discovered irrational numbers or something like that. There's some kind of probably apocryphal story about that would go along with the notion of tragedy and whatnot. I just want to point that out. You can go ahead, Ed.
Okay. I wanted to build on what you and Nevin had said. And I think Sean talking about limits in the face of what we appear to be choices. But I was reading a bunch of review articles, and one brought up something that I thought was interesting, that a lottery is a juxtaposition of chance within a type of determinism. Because if you think about it, a lottery can determine their fate, but that capacity is based on chance. So it's an odd combination of both views of the universe. All right, that the chance is an inevitable component of life, even if it is being determined by some kind of organization. And another one, I wanted to defer to you all who seem to be much better in mathematics than me, but actually bringing up the concept of algorithms and how algorithms seem to be much more powerful today in terms of determining so much in our lives, more programmatic chance. and they use the analogy with the Babylonian lottery that over time, there was an increase in its complexity and the total number of people affected by it. Also, over time, ironically enough, as it became more and more important, fewer Babylonians understood how the lottery worked. And 3, oddly enough, they also in some ways ignored the encroachment of the lottery in their everyday lives in a whole range of issues. And anyway, just wanted to share that.
So I think the most interesting part of this story, this is another one that's, there's so much depth in all these allusions that I know I only understood a very small portion of it, which kind of goes along with the theme of the story in a way, because I see it as, it's kind of that they say basically, okay, let's see where the line is. So in my book, at least, which I guess probably means nothing, it's on 33. It says, this doctrinal item observed that the lottery is an interpolation of chance in the order of the world, and that oh wait, that's a different one. Anyways, I think towards the very end, it talks about these different ways of interpreting the company. And basically, the way that I see it is that this very last thing that he says, that it is indifferent to affirm or deny the reality of this shadowy corporation because Babylon is nothing else than an infinite game of chance. And I think that the company essentially is kind of this paradox in itself, in that, there's this idea of like a planned chance, that there's something hidden behind these orders of, random things, think of just like just typical conspiracy, is that the idea that there's no coincidences, that all these things are planned out, that somebody orchestrated this. There's some kind of intelligence and intentionality behind these things that are seemingly chance occurrences. he's kind of reversing that and saying that all these chance occurrences, seemingly chance occurrences, could be part of something planned. There's something actually secretly planning out chance occurrences. So I think that's a really interesting reversal, but I think it points out something that's like, well, there's always kind of this background, I guess, to any kind of event that seems to make sense as something that's, we'd say that's not chance. And that, there's always like this background of nonsense that things appear within that then give it meaning, in the sense that, there's constantly all this information going on, and then out of nowhere it'll suddenly appear something that makes sense within that background. And I think what he's kind of trying to do is make us aware of that background by kind of giving a reversal, like a Gestalt switch between, meaning as something intended that's there, this event that we can make sense of, and then this background of nonsense of things that aren't unintended, this like infinity, this swarm of causation that we just can't understand. And he's kind of reversing that, so that like the actual events that we have are actually kind of like decentered in this interesting way. So yeah.
Are you saying, I was trying to follow you. Let me just say how I'll react to you, Chase, and that is, try to imagine we're all in this group of now 8 of us. We're going to try to understand every single thing that happens on Earth. Think of how many different individual pieces of information, concepts, theoretical tools we would have. Because of our limited knowledge, a lot of things don't make sense, but people want the world to make sense. There seems to be a very deep desire, need of people to say, damn it, my life is not based on a series of chance meetings. Okay, it is not that contingent. And that is why you will have some people in desperation go to these most bizarre, overarching explanations for why the world is doing, right? Is it the Illuminati? Is it Henry Kissinger and a cabal? Or is it, do you ever hear of QAnon, where they think that there is this bizarre conspiracy, including the Democratic Party headquarters from a pizza parlor operating out of a basement that doesn't have a basement? So the more we try to explain from any one philosophical system, it seems to me, is going to be incomplete. It's not going to cover everything, and yet we want it to cover everything. We want something totalistic.
Yeah, and I think, I completely agree that there seems to be, I don't know if it's innate or if it's cultural or what, but a desperate need for things to make sense. And, one of the places you see this most poignantly is when someone dies, apparently randomly. And, if you listen on the, well, I listen to the radio a lot, and you will often hear them saying, I don't understand. This doesn't make any sense. And then you hear people talking about, well, that's the job of the clergyman or whatever, is to make sense of this. How can we make sense of this? Or how can we put this random, terrible event into a narrative context that somehow renders it intelligible? And because there's this deep need for everything to be intelligible. And I think this is probably very much like what Camus referred to when he talked about the absurd. When he said life is absurd, I heard one person complain. Actually, it was in the Camus fiction seminar. Well, it's not absurd. I mean, you can explain things in terms of causation and all that, but I don't think that's what he means. I think what he means is that the world is absurd in the sense that no intelligent, benevolent being would make things happen this way. So it's absurd in terms of sort of an intelligent design or intelligent teleology. So yeah, sure, things happen according to laws of physics and so on, but that doesn't help me when, you know, my child just dies of cancer for no damn reason. That's the absurdity, is that there is no, like you say, no overarching story. There is no narrative context in which this could make any kind of sense from a human existential meanings point of view. And so that's what I wonder if, you know, both of you, it seems to be are working on this idea that the company is sort of a stand-in for saying there must be, yeah, even though there's this random chance, you know, it's kind of like the thing, if you talk to, you know, I grew up a Christian fundamentalist, and if you point out something that appears to be terrible, you know, they will always say, well, that's in the plan of God. And if you say, well, how could that possibly be the plan of God? Well, we don't understand the mind of God, but in the grand universe, God has a plan here. And I have a faith, you know, that my wife being shot to death as an innocent bystander in a bank robbery, that's part of God's plan. And I think, you know, maybe the company is kind of again, a non-theistic sort of stand-in for, there's got to be some principle here that makes these apparently random events intelligible in human terms.
Yeah, and what struck me too, Nevitt, in this story is, look at the last paragraph where he gives different explanations or different positions on, does the lottery exist? And it's very interesting to me because that's what he leaves us with in this story. He's not telling us what he thinks. He's giving all the interpretations, right? One, even though he's sarcastic in some of them, one abominably insinuates that the company has not existed for centuries, that the sacred disorders are purely heredity. But I also look at the ambiguity. The second view is, another judges it eternal. Well, you could say that it refers to the lottery, but it could refer to the sacred disorder of our lives. But say it's the lottery. Another judges it eternal and will last until the last night. A third is, yeah, it exists, but it only is interested in little things, right? The shadows of rust and of dust. And then the fourth, right? It has never existed, will not exist. And then, and it's almost like, you know, one's an atheistic, one's an agnostic. You know, it seems like it's, and I want to defer to you who are really more deep in philosophy, but it seems like I would love to go through these choices. Okay, what is the lottery? What are the people's interpretation of the lottery? You know, is it God as a watchmaker? You know, yeah, he set everything in motion, then he steps back, has some coffee, or no, God doesn't exist at all, or we're not sure. I mean, I think the ambiguity of this last paragraph is very interesting, and I think that Borges really was thinking through what he was doing by giving all these different interpretations as to the existence of the lottery.
Yeah, I think especially the theological interpretations they were brought up are really interesting. Is in a sense, so he says, you know, in that last paragraph, so he talks about you know, of course the company avoids all publicity. Their agents are secret. That essentially imposters are no different from the actual company. And we can never know whether this guy who strangled his wife is actually secretly acting out this chance that's been set up by the company or not. And he says, you know, this person who strangles the woman who sleeps at his side, do they not execute perhaps a secret decision of the company that silent functioning comparable to God's gives rise to all sorts of conjectures. And then he goes on and gives these different interpretations like that. But I think it's interesting that it's kind of like this vision of the God of the gaps, you know, the God that can basically give this sense of a semblance of purpose and order to these things that happen. And I think what Borges is trying to do is show that gap of the God of the gaps. Essentially there's an epistemological gap between, well, how do we know that this is part of, you know, this plan or not? Because it seems like you could equally say that everything is part of this, or that only small things are part of this, or that nothing is a part of this, or it was in the past but not now, and those are all the same, essentially. And I think that's very interesting. That so Terence McKenna, he talks about conspiracy theories as epistemological cartoons. Essentially, you know, something happens, you know, so, I don't know, something blows up, you know, and then there'll be theories for that. I think Borges would want to say possibly that like almost all these ideas are basically kind of on a continuum of conspiracy theory in a sense. That, you know, there's not just like, oh, this is one absurd theory, but this is the correct one. He'd want to show that basically all of them are kind of like epistemological cartoons to a certain degree. That's why he talks about history in this paragraph above that. So he says, basically, you know, trying to talk about the history. So one thing I thought was really clever in here, he says, furthermore, there is nothing so contaminated with fiction as the history of the company. I think that's interesting considering this story, which is fiction, is itself a kind of history of the company. So I thought that was pretty clever. So he says our historians, who are the most penetrating on the globe, have invented a method to correct chance. It is well known that the operations of this method are in general reliable, although naturally they are not divulged without some portion of deceit. So he's saying that even history, in a sense, has to. So he talks about basically any person who writes something down in a way kind of changes it. Any historian naturally is going to have some kind of deceit added to it. And then he says basically, was this part of the company also or not? So even our understanding of the company and its own writings could be changed by the most penetrating historical interpretation of it. There's no way to actually know where it ends and where it begins in any possible way. In the same way, you know, I could say, yeah, shape-shifting reptilians are controlling things. But how do I know that? How do I know the shape-shifting reptilians didn't actually, it's really shape-shifting amphibians, and they just kind of changed that to make me think that it's reptilians, and basically it self-destructs itself. And that's why we can't know these things. So there's this epistemological gap that keeps coming back between this idea of, you know, these hidden orders of order that give us these chance encounters. Yeah.
One thing that because I liked a lot of the analysis that Schiller giving, and like one thing that I can even pile onto that. I mean, I think it's a little bit interesting to think about the way. So if we're talking about sort of scribes purposefully, you know, sort of choosing to put errors into their manuscripts, right, in order for those things to be carried down. I mean, it makes me think of two things in a religious context. One, it makes me think of Gnostic doctrines, in the sense that, right, with Gnostic doctrines, there will be an outward-facing doctrine, and then some bits of that will be oversimplifications or half-truths or just out and out like lies according to higher levels of the doctrinal interpretation. And so like the idea is that as you become initiated into a Gnostic cult, you find out like which things were true and which things were false, and you have revealed to you a greater reality. The other thing that it makes me think about is the way that, so if you get into the nitty gritty details of a biblical literalist interpretation of the Bible, is so if you're going to be a biblical literalist and you're, say, a King James Bible person, well, okay, so their explanation of that is that there was a miracle, basically, that like God interceded and made it so that the King James Bible was a correct, perfect, sort of book, whereas all of these other versions are obviously like degradations or misinterpretations. But then there's a whole like complicated discussion in literature surrounding this question of, okay, well, if we want to give a biblical interpretation of this, well, why is it that this particular bit is in, right? And so right, the biblical sort of, there's like a biblical absolutist, biblical literalist stance, right? So it's sort of like God basically guided the hands of everybody that wrote the Bible and made it be written in a very specific kind of way, which then you have to ask questions like, okay, well, we know that there were transcription errors, just in terms of like, preserving these documents over time. And then on top of that, we know that when you go through the process of translating the book into, into a new language, right? If you want to read it in anything other than the combination Greek Hebrew that it was originally written in, you have to like, okay, so there's going to be transcription errors because people are going to make mistakes, and then on top of that, there's going to be translation problems. This attempt to like get the words into a new sort of meaning. But then there are like shades of different, because like, do you really want to buy that like God literally guided the hand? So there are like various shades of like, well, why is it that a particular like thing is in the Bible? And there are like shades of severity, right? So one step down from like a biblical literalist interpretation that I think is a very interesting one is this view that I forget what the term is for it exactly, but that God intended for everything that is in the Bible to be in the Bible. Now that might sound like exactly the same thing as the thing I just said, but here's the difference. It isn't that necessarily everything in the Bible is the word of God in the sense that like it is him authoring it, but that the collection of works that are in it are were like sort of intentionally set up to arrive like in this cumulative work. And part of like the benefit of buying in this interpretation instead of an alternative is that it allows for contradiction within the Bible, because what you can say is that, well, it's not God contradicting himself. It's God trying to make some sort of like point, and he's making that point by like giving us two contradictory opinions and then giving us some sort of instruction on how to make a sense between those two different contradictions. Maybe they're paradoxical, maybe there's a legitimate contradiction and you need to pick one or the other, and right, maybe there's some sort of instruction. So like one thing that this is used to for instance deal with is like the right in sort of the Old Testament, some of the bloodier aspects of it. The argument is well, the reason why those things are present isn't because God sort of literally told the Israelites to go out and kill lots of people. Like it's like the argument is it's effectively like biblical irony. Like God is trying to make a point by showing you an example of what you shouldn't be doing, if that makes sense. So right, so there are all these sort of like shades, but all of it is about like interpreting intention into these errors that are present in this particular kind of work, right? You either interpret them as intentional in the sense that they bring you to a more correct version, like if you're going to be a King James, right, sort of expector, or like interpreting like the presence of like contradictory expectations, or right, you can kind of flow down, right? Because there are also less severe interpretations of like why the Bible is constructed in the way that it particularly is. The thing that I want to mention, I guess like kind of apart from what we all have been talking about, well, I have two things, because one is that like this one really made me think of Italo, Italo Calvino, Invisible Cities. And in particular, there's a couple of them in here. They're pretty short, but I'm not going to read them out to you guys because I would feel self-conscious about that. Cities in the Sky 4. That one was particularly interesting to this one. And then Cities in the Dead 3. I mean, those are like kind of two of my favorites from this, but they're, but it like, Calvino and Invisible Cities follows almost the exact same formula as this, right? Like he tells us about a city, and then it has like some sort of weird thing going on. Like the basic conceit is that this is Marco Polo telling Kublai Khan about all of the cities that are in his vast empire, because it's literally so large that he can't visit all of them, and so he can't really know anything about them. So and he's like distressed about this. So Marco Polo is telling him about these various cities. And then the interesting thing as you go through the cities is that like a lot of them are impossible. A lot of them don't even make sense in the time period. Like there's like very early on, there's a city that has like bus routes and like modern architecture. And you're like, how is this in the Mongolian Empire, right? It's like, oh, it's right. So there's this sort of like impossible character to a lot of the cities, either like temporally or literally just in terms of what they describe. I don't know what to make of that exactly. Like, it would make sense that maybe if Calvino sort of read this and was sort of imitating Borges, but was like taking a specific thing that he occasionally seems to do. Because I got similar feelings from Talon. And so that's something that y'all might want to check out. I think I might be able to sort of photocopy those particular cities and share them with y'all for people who don't have access to the book.
Yeah, could you at least like write in the chat which stories you recommend?
Sure.
So I believe he was influenced by Borges. And I know at least a lot of critics, they compare the two in terms of Borges in a way kind of started the whole hypertext kind of thing, metafiction, a lot of this stuff. So I've seen him compared a lot along with Umberto Eco, another Italian. He's Italian, right? I think.
Yeah.
And so I've seen a lot of those comparisons. So with Philip K. Dick also. He's a little different, less kind of literary, I would say. But I think those are interesting connections. I've never read Calvino or Eco, so I can't really.
I've only read Eco's nonfiction. I've read his work on because he was also associated with the Frankfurt School. And so I read some of his stuff that he wrote kind of in response to Adorno. And I've read bits and pieces of his book on beauty, but I've never read his nonfiction. But I can definitely vouch honestly, Invisible Cities is probably the best book I've ever read. And it's weirdly meditative because like each city is like, they're between like a half a page and I think the longest one is like 4 pages long. So they're like really short. It's easy to kind of breeze through them. And they just have like a weird conceit. Like the two that I shared, Cities in the Dead 3 is about a city where there's a whole undercity that is filled with the dead. And like there seems to be like sort of an priesthood that exists that facilitates the passage of knowledge from the undercity of the dead into the above city. And it's like, basically the city of the dead invents new fashions, like, you know, comes up with new sorts of things to do, right? There's this interesting thing where like what job you do in the city of the dead you get to pick it, which means that like there are a lot more like big game hunters and stuff, like it's sort of it's wish fulfillment. When you end up in the city of the dead, you get to do, you know, the job that you prefer to do instead of necessarily the job that you did in life. So super like interesting sort of city take. And then Cities in the Sky 4, this conceit is basically it's a city that was built exactly according to the recommendations of a group of astronomers. Like these people astrologers. So these people got together, a bunch of astrologers, and like compiled a bunch of astrological data, and then they built a city that was supposed to be like almost sort of feng shui like designed to capture all of the best sort of luck and potentiality into the city. And then the kind of like punchline of the story is that, well, so they built the city, and it turns out that like they still have like lepers and dwarves and like unmentionables, right? And people who are like horrific, basically. So they aren't the sort of like perfect city that they're sort of attempting to pretend to be. And it becomes like a kind of discussion of like the fact, like how do you interpret this with respect to the question of what do we mean by the veracity of astrology, right? If we're going to try and sort of preserve that, how do we interpret this failure of these astrologers to build an ideal city? Anyway, sorry, I think I cut you off, Chase. You also appear to have like visually disappeared.
Chase seems to
totally dropped.
I wanted to, if it's okay, Chase made a point which a lot of others did, and that was Chase mentioned the phrase the hypertextual novel, and Carlos Fuentes made the argument that the contemporary Latin American novel would have been impossible without Borges, which is really interesting because Borges never wrote a novel, and yet you can think of Julio Cortázar, who wrote Hopscotch, which can be considered a hypertextual novel, and it seems to me that Borges anticipated and at the same time brought up, created a foundation for other authors to really run with in a much expanded form, as the Latin American novelists did, and think of the term magical realism, which was very important in Latin American literature. So I just didn't want us to forget the point that that he had made.
The some of the stuff that Sean was talking about reminded me of another Christian trope, is that when something, like if you pray for something and it doesn't happen, then that's a closed door. And if you pray for something and it does happen, then that's an open door. And of course, it's God that's opening and closing these doors. And so this sort of theological framework is, I ran into this word a while back, is the technical word is incorrigible, because no matter what happens, the interpretation can accept it, because if something terrible happens, it's the plan of God. If something positive happens, it's the plan of God. No matter what it is, it's the plan of God. And so I think, again, it seems to be, this need we have for things to be intelligible. And I wonder, one of the difficulties that I have is I get this sense from Nietzsche and from the existentialists. I can't remember if it was Sean or Chase that said something like this, but you have the data of experience, but the interpretation is underdetermined by the data of experience. And so you've got stuff happening in life, but the narrative that you use to explain that is in excess of the facts, right? So a set of facts of your life can be susceptible to almost an indefinite number of interpretations. And so then, a theological interpretation is one way of doing that. The company is another way of doing that, creating a narrative framework that produces a narrative meaning out of this collection of facts. And then in my view, Nietzsche's recommendation, and then on explicitly some existentialist recommendation, is then since there is no overarching narrative, there is no company, there is no divine plan, then we are free to construct whatever narrative we want. And so we should construct a narrative that is maximally something, healthy or meaningful or whatever. But then the difficulty for me is it's hard for me to live in a story and take it seriously when I realize I just made that shit up. And so, I make up a story that makes sense of my life, but I'm like, I just made that up. So how am I supposed to take that serious if I just made that up? And, the narratives like The Company or God or whatever take care of that problem because they just tell you, well, this is the right narrative and it's not coming from you and it's coming from some transcendent, mysterious source. And so you can just accept that's the right narrative. And, it's very comforting. Go ahead, Sean.
Oh yeah, one thing that since I'm so in favor of throwing wrenches, I don't quite know if this is a wrench, but like it is curious to me because if we have this interpretation of the company as this transcendent explanation, it kind of like it's this almost kind of the opposite thing with Talon, because like with Talon, I have this accusation that like I just think that there's a lot more idealism in the world than the reverse, where it just doesn't seem like there's that much materialism in the world in Talon. And with the company in Babylon, it seems like there is a much more willingness to allow. I don't know why my video likes to crash so much. A willingness to allow irregularity and chance into an interpretation that is supposed to be providing this sort of structural thing that's supposed to give us answers to our questions. Like the company doesn't appear to be malicious or beneficent. It just seems to make random choices and then insistently, right, and sort of secretly and through sort of spies or agents or however we're sort of describing them, cause all of the things that its statistical work tells it to do. So like I don't know what do we make of that basically? Like why is it that that Babylon seems to be okay with this element of chance and their transcendent explanation?
I think I have like a take. It's not solid, but it's just I think it seems likely or something might be interesting. I think that I don't know if this is what Borges was critiquing or acknowledging or confronting with this particular story, but the notion of the company, I think, really made me think about. Do you guys know who a guy named Louis Althusser is? You know Althusser? Yeah. Okay. Chase. Yeah. Okay. So, Reeser, you said something that was kind of interesting. You said that that these things in our lives, these events or these comings and goings, we can look at them as having a million different reasons, right? And so in some way they're underdetermined or something. But I according to Althusser, that's an overdetermination. You know what I mean? It's way overdetermined. There are way more causes than there are effects. There are 1,000 different explanations for this thing going on, and this openness, this field of potentiality for explaining the things retroactively that have already occurred is, I think Freud calls it the virtual negative. But this, according to Althusser, is the basis for an ideological relationship to your world. And ideology, I think Zizek makes a really interesting illustration, or like a point that really well illustrates what I'm trying to get at. And he says that Nazism as an ideology is very similar to playing Pokemon Go, in the sense that you you walk around your normal day-to-day life. You have your normal boring life that is miserable, and then you download Pokemon Go and you begin walking around through your previously miserable life, and you point it at certain areas, and suddenly there's this beautiful transcendent meaning that's been added to these things. Oh, there's a Pokemon. Oh, there's a okay. There's suddenly these centers of meaning that weren't there. And that's the same feeling that overcame the average German citizen under Nazism, that from going from nothing makes sense and I'm overwhelmed and I'm totally perplexed by my surroundings, suddenly, oh, it's the Jews. And then they say, oh, there's a Jewish guy there, or there's a Jewish guy there. It's suddenly, oh, okay, one of the thousands of potential arguments or reasonings is suddenly being highlighted by this ideology, by this transcendent meaning that makes the irrational, incomplete idea that we have of our experience into this discursive, rationalized system that we can approach and deal with. It makes you feel confident, in control.
So I think, okay, first of all, the idea of Pokemon Go as like Nazism is hilarious to me. Uh, my brother is obsessed with Pokemon Go. I don't know, he's like in his 30s, but seriously plays Pokemon Go for like hours a day, like drive around going like 20 miles an hour, like that. And I was like, "You're absurd. You're an absurd human being. Like, what is this?" And now I can call him a Nazi. So thank you for that.
I was
But
gonna joke. Of course, the Japanese come up with Pokemon Go, right?
yeah,
Yeah, it's only natural. It just made sense.
Well,
yeah. So okay, so I think that is a kind of good way of seeing is like I think what's going on here, and it's maybe not even just Babylon, but you know, of course, you can see this as kind of allegory for ourselves in the sense that there's always going to be okay. Since you brought up, you know, like Zizek and whatnot, you can think of like Lacan, and like you know, there's the real, and then there's the symbolic and the imaginary. Basically, the symbolic and the imaginary are kind of like this grid structure that we use to kind of create some kind of semblance of order, and then the real is something that can't be represented, that kind of ruptures through and breaks down all these things. And I think you can definitely, that gives a kind of hint of kind of the dynamics of what's going on there. And looks like my internet is doing a bunch of crazy stuff. But I think one thing that's interesting is that it seems like the point that is being told in this story is that there's almost like no difference I mean, one thing I think is interesting is he talks all this time about these Babylonians are actually obsessed with fate, that they're into fate, and that's why. But then they also have this dynamic of wanting to introduce all of this chance into their lives, and then to see everything in terms of chance. And I wonder exactly how those are connected in the sense of, you know, believing like that there's faith, that there's some kind of determination or preset order to these things, and that chance, though, is something you have to introduce. And so why do they choose to introduce this? But then, so I think that's an interesting point, as well as just like this. I'm not even sure how to explain it, but it's just kind of like it captures something about just the natural chance that is there anyways, whether they introduce it or not. And I think that's one of the interesting things that the story makes. Yeah, I could talk about some of the stuff that Sean's bringing up about the Gnosticism and the esoteric interpretations. I think that would be a good segue into the Pierre Menard, but I'm just going to let people respond to that.
Oh God, I had something that I wanted to say, but my brain just dropped it.
if I could throw out something about Pierre Menard, we usually think a text has meaning, correct? That, I mean, how many philosophical works have you all read and talked about in the different seminars? And every single text we read, we make an assumption that the text is intelligible. Even if we go the Gnostic route and, ooh, it's special knowledge and I'm not going to know all of it, but I have to start with this from the outside to be able to maybe be an initiate into the order. If a text is intelligible on its own terms, why does it matter who wrote it?
I mean, that's a very Derridian way to approach text, to be fair. Which, to be fair, I mean, I like the way Derrida does that. Although it seems, because he also, right, there's the whole Nietzsche, I've forgotten my umbrella rabbit hole. I totally remember, by the way, the thing I was going to say. So with Chase, with respect to the randomness intrusion thing, the only thing that's cropping up to my brain is So I know with elections in ancient Athens, it would be like, okay, so all of the various tribes participate in this process, and we end up with like a pool of candidates. So you'd end up with like 12 candidates or whatever. But then, so they would get legitimately elected by their local constituency or whatever. But then they would leave the final choice between those, like that pool of candidates, up to a random chance. So they would basically, like, you know, put all their names into a basket, shake it up, and then pull it out. And their explanation, well, why do we, in the last round of choosing our officials who help run things, why do we make it random? And they say, well, we always want to give the gods the last say, right? So we want to insert this possibility of chance into what is otherwise like a democratic elective process, specifically because we want to give a space for the divine to sort of work its will between the various choices that we've narrowed down. I don't know if that helps in terms of explaining what's going on in Babylon, but it occurred to me that that's a thing.
If we move to Pierre Menard, my favorite passage, it's page 43 here, but it's the obvious one. My favorite passage in this book is where he says, "It is a revelation to compare Menard's Don Quixote with Cervantes." And then he has this quotation. On the other hand, Cervantes said exactly the same quotation, and they are so different. Anyway, I thought that was hilarious.
But there was actually some thought behind how he was interpreting it, assuming it was written by the different person, right? You know,
yeah, in a different historical context and a different background and so on. And so, you know, I feel like, I mean, some of you guys probably are more qualified than I am, you know, Sean, and I don't know, maybe Chase, but maybe some of you guys, but I think this fits into the domain of literary criticism. And like you said, the notion of authorship and uniqueness and all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, so that's where I kept comparing it kind of to, you know, ideas in, you know, post-structuralism and whatnot that I'm not going to pretend like I have some amazing expert grasp of these things. They're very complex, difficult to understand, but so I think what, you know, Roland Barthes and Foucault and Derrida, what they're kind of saying is that the text itself is kind of an autonomous creation that is separate from kind of cartoonish persona that is applied to. Can you guys hear me?
You froze. You've totally froze. Could repeat what you said?
Yeah, my internet is quite awful today. But anyways, I think what the point I want to make is that, you know, from this perspective, you know, kind of like the post-structuralists, they're going to say that a text is actually something that's autonomous, that the author as a kind of singular example of what brings it into being is a kind of genetic fallacy that says that, you know, yeah, you can explain it all by this origin, and then this origin itself is a pretty abstract thing of this person. And I think there's definitely some really good points in that sense, and that, well, do we attribute all meaning in a text to author intention? I think that is a very difficult argument to make. But then I think to say that the the person, or at least the circumstances, the cultural context in which the writer put that text into existence, that has some influence then on the text in the way that the reader can know about this, can learn about this. And, the post-structurists like to say that it's more about the reader, that the death of the author is the birth of the reader. That's what Barthes says. And that, but still, as a reader, I can learn about Borges, I can learn about these people. And so my internet keeps messing up, so I'm just going to stop talking.
Well, if I could build on what you just said, Chase, and some people have actually interpreted this to transcend authorship, place of the author in the interpretation of the text, to say that, and you mentioned a reader, right, or readers, that what Borges was getting at is you and I reading the same text could come up with different interpretations. We could highlight different elements in that text, and the text, begging your pardon for using this phrase, but can mean something different, right? I mean, you might read it and say, oh, this is a second-rate fill in the blank of a philosopher's name. But I haven't read that other philosopher, and I'm meeting this philosophical school for the first time, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, wow, this is showing me something that I was kind of going to grope towards, and all of a sudden it's right here in front of me, right? And I think he uses, it might be in a different essay, Kafka and his precursors, but that every single author creates his own precursors, right? Because we don't read literature, we don't read philosophy in the chronological order that they were written. So we will many times read something earlier than Kafka after we've read Kafka, or we'll read Dostoevsky, whatever. And so because we don't read in the same chronological order of the authors written, we're going to come to those texts differently than someone who would have read it. Say, imagine reading Moby Dick when it came out in 1850. What was that experience like compared to someone reading it after World War II, right? I mean, is Ahab and Kurtz in Heart of Darkness the first representations in literature of the totalitarian personality, Ahab and Kurtz. And interestingly enough, they're both written by people who were intimately knowledgeable about sailing, about ships, about that whole dynamic of the captain and the crew. But anyway, I think that in some ways people have just looked at this in some ways as how readers affect the text, and because every reader interprets each text that he or she is reading.
Yeah. In particular, on that same page where he quotes the same text twice, he says the contrast in style is also vivid. The archaic style of Menard, quite foreign after all, suffers from a certain affectation, not so that of his forerunner, who handles with ease the current Spanish of his time. And so, naively, I think of style as being a feature of the text, but it's the same text, right? So how could you say that they have this contrast in style? But in this case, the contrast in style is a function of the context of the author, which is an odd idea for me. And then, from the sort of things you guys are talking about, it's probably also a function of the reader. Like I read some kinds of novels that, some contemporary kinds of novels, I just have no idea what the hell's going on. And I don't really understand the stylistic moves the author's making. And for me, the style is just impenetrable. whereas for someone else who's sort of familiar with, like I had, to an analogy, I had a friend many years ago who was in an orchestra in a university. He played violin, and he said you kind of have to be educated. You have to have understood something about music in order to appreciate certain kinds of music. So some kinds of popular music are fairly accessible more or less immediately, but there are other kinds of music where if you haven't learned something about the way music works, it's much more difficult to really appreciate and enjoy what's happening there. And so it seems like maybe there's a similar sort of thing here, that the style is it's not only, it's in the way, it's in the context of the author as well as in the reader, not merely in the way that it's written itself.
Yeah, this is more of just kind of a personal experience kind of thing, but I've been reading a lot of books that I read back in high school, and I remember liking them a lot. I remember liking the ideas, but now I'm rereading them and having just kind of like a completely different perspective and seeing things that I didn't see before, but also just kind of like seeing things in a different light, based on the experiences I've been through since then. And I don't know, I've almost seen it as like a way of measuring kind of how much I've changed, and to be able to look at that and this is someone else's experience, and sure, there are things about it that are similar, but in a way it gives me this chance to see something that I know hasn't changed and see my perspective change over time. So I don't know how related that is, but I think that that's something really valuable as a reader.
I was a teaching assistant in a philosophy class at UT, and the professor who was my advisor made the students read the first half of Kierkegaard's The Concept of Dread, which is all about despair. And these are like, teens and early 20s sitting in his class. And he told them at one time, he said, you are not, he's a Korean guy. He's like, you will not understand any of this. It will make absolutely no sense to you. But when you have a midlife crisis, you will remember Kierkegaard and you will come back and read this and you will understand. And so it's kind of like Travis is saying, he was kind of like, kind of stuffing this thing in their mind so that when they have this kind of experience of despair, they'll like go back and read Kierkegaard, and it would be a completely different book for someone who's in middle age.
Yeah, and maybe that's even just a good reason to read something maybe that you don't first understand or don't enjoy. It's like that kind of can plant a seed in your mind, and someday you'll notice something and be able to go back and kind of maybe understand it better.
So
begging your pardon. Go ahead.
Okay, so my internet's really bad, so I may just be cut off in the middle of this, but so Deleuze has this idea of the virtual event, that basically these things that happen aren't just pure actuality, but they continue, kind of like Bergson's idea, the past continues into the present, into the future. And so these things are never fully exhausted. And I think you can see reading something is like a virtual event where it can keep coming back and reiterating itself and all these different types of meanings based off of our progression through time. And, all these ways that we learn things can make us appreciate it, or it can make us hate it. And that I think a lot of what he's trying to get at is, this role of the reader in terms of the meaning, in the sense that so in a lot of the ancient cultures, they saw it not as an author exactly as who was responsible for what they produced. They saw the person who produced it, like the storyteller, as more of a medium, and he could be praised for his performance of these things, but he wasn't credited to the actual creation of the art object itself. That was more taken to be something that was divine because it was, bringing something new into creation. And that was more subject of something that was divine in that sense. So I think that's an important way to see this, because you could see then that the art object could be something that has its own autonomy apart from who creates it, in a sense that the author, the writer, is really more someone who's kind of a functionary of the object coming into existence itself. I think that's really interesting, even though that's hard to imagine today, because things are so particular and we give so much meaning in our legal capitalist culture to basically property, to, you know, formal names attached to legal systems of property and blah, 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 blah. But I think it's really interesting to see that, like, okay, when Quixote was first written, basically it was something that always had this potential as a kind of autonomous object going through time, and like this virtual potential to be taken up by other people and used in all these different ways. And I think that's kind of what's going on here, in the sense that, well, we can still take up that novel, you know, centuries later as readers or even as writers ourselves, and give it something new in that sense, by kind of this channeling act, for lack of better terms. But yeah, that's my say on that.
Just wanted to bring up another Borges, I guess you call it a short story. It's called The Other. And Borges, when he's, I believe, in his 50s or early 60s, comes to a park, sits down, starts talking to a man, and realizes it's his younger self. And they start talking about literature. And Walt Whitman comes up. And Borges explains that Whitman, through the creative act, is inventing things. And the younger Borges says, no, Whitman would never lie. And I just thought that was such a, and then the older Borges smiles and says to himself, well, I guess having lived 30 years has given me some advantages, or something, the words of that effect. But Travis, I wanted to, when you mentioned what you said about going back and reading books from high school, I thought of that story. So it'd be interesting to read it. The Other.
Yeah, I take some comfort that I have experience that you guys don't have. So you guys are all young and handsome and have hair.
And have hair.
I'm old and ugly and bald. And
I have hair for now, but give me like 5 years, probably gone.
I've been thinking about shaving it off. Like this is what quarantines do.
No, don't you dare do that.
A big mass back there, and it's getting so annoying, and I just want to like go bald and then see what happens.
John, I am so jealous of your hair. I mean, seriously, it's like, I see this guy walking around. It's like, oh my god, what a beautiful head of hair that guy's got.
You can cut
when
it.
I was in college, I had long hair, so I have a thing about long hair.
I wanted to do, like, because I know we're about 5 over, but I wanted to make a huge callback to a thing that Nevitt said much earlier on, and it's a thing that I basically set up a rotation for myself. So I'm reading 4 books right now. I'm reading the Creative Evolution, I'm reading Labyrinths, and I've been reading Worshipping Power, and I'm about to start reading Borderlands. But Worshipping Power is this anarchist book that's been making me kind of rethink a lot of the traditional sort of like anthropological things that I've been taught. And in particular, the way that it's talked about the Roman Empire and the Middle Ages has been really interesting. The main reason that I mention it is we sort of said that this desire for an all-encompassing, orderly explanation of the world is sort of intrinsic to human beings. And one of the things that Worshipping Power has been prompting me to think about is like, how much of what I interpret as intrinsic to human beings is actually intrinsic to people who find themselves living in a statist society? Because living in a statist society, like a state will try to reproduce a particular vision of the world that aligns with the existence and the continuing power of the state. And it seems as though, right, I mean, states have two incentives to try and make us think in this particular kind of way. One, they are themselves entities that believe in a certain kind of hierarchical order because they consist of that hierarchical order. So they want to persuade us that the world should look like that kind of hierarchical order. Yeah, I like it, Chase. So if we, right, and then on top of that, a lot of them seem to align themselves with religious views that believes in the same kind of divine intercession, right? So, right, if we're Christians, we believe in that, like, there's a sort of divine plan that orders the world. But even if we're going back, so worshiping power has convinced me that the Roman state, both under the Republic and the Empire, was like an intensely authoritarian entity. Like there that there's huge problems with it, basically, if we wanted to think of it as like a democratic institution or anything like that.
Well, but if you, oh, I thought you were done.
Oh no, I was very close. I apologize.
No.
There's this huge emphasis in their culture on reading oracular signs, right? So it was a traditional thing in Rome that you would go to the priest goes to the edge of the temple and sees events, watches events happening, and then interprets those as signs of events to come. And it seems to me that this is a thing that I see over and over again, where you can look at a culture that appears to have like a serious statist authoritarian element to it. So like the Greeks or the Romans or the Babylonians. And then there is a contingent ideological commitment to an orderly world. And I don't know enough about the history of anarchist cultures to know whether or not there's an associated desire for an orderly world. At the very least, I would assume it looks different. But I mean, are we certain that this is the nature of a human desire to want an orderly world, or are we being prompted to think of the world as orderly?
All human cultures are going to try to sustain themselves. So, I mean, look at societies that are pre-statal, right? There's a transmission of knowledge, right? Transmission of mores in terms of sexuality, child rearing, any kind of religious belief systems. You can have hunting and gathering societies, trust me. They were trying to affect the people who were in their community, right? You're gonna hunt with us and you're gonna gather, right? And people were taught, hey, this is good, you can eat it and this will kill you, even if the two look similar. So to me, think of the biological coercive fact that we have a very long childhood compared to other species of mammals. There has to be the transmission of information to replicate human cultures. All right. I mean, 2 years old, a dog's considered an adult. And I'm not denigrating other mammals because there's more and more evidence of birds and others using tools. And a fascinating study about birds in New Zealand, where there's actually at least 5 different types of tools that these birds use. They've modified twigs, and you see it right in front of you. Say, oh my God, that's specification. That's a really important specification of these twigs and how they've been modified. But I mean, yes, states have a tendency to become more and more powerful over time. But if you look at hunting and gathering societies, you have the attempt at replication of those societies, no matter how small. And if someone becomes destructive to those societies, right? What does the group do if a person is threatening the existence of the group?
Right, and the replication aspect wasn't necessarily what I was curious about there. I guess the question that I have is that there is a specific kind of hierarchical view of the world that's implicit in this desire for like a just world theory, that like God is determining that everything happened in a specific kind of way. And it seems to me that assumption about the world is reflected in the kind of like statist organization of the world that, for instance, tries to, right, like if we're being Hammurabi about this, like we're going to make it so that this particular punishment is associated with this particular crime, and there's a just order to the world, and we are the representatives of this just order. So I mean, this is like the question that I'm curious about is like, is this an intrinsic human desire to want a transcendent explanation of a something ordering everything, or is this something that living in a state prepares us to believe? Like I guess that's the thing that I'm curious about, because then presumably, right, whatever the alternative explanation is of how it is that explanation works in an anarchist society, would be the thing that they are attempting to replicate and pass on to the next sort of generation. But is it similar, or is it something fundamentally different?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. It reminds me of I've always assumed that guilt and shame are just a natural part of human psychology, and it's like Nietzsche seems to assume the same sort of thing. But then I once heard someone, I don't have the source on this, but someone said something to the Dalai Lama about feeling guilty and worthless or something, and it was like, why would you feel that? And the suggestion being that some of that is grounded in, well, perhaps, for example, in Christian theology and the Puritan founding of this nation and that sort of thing. And so it seems like that's a worthwhile question to ask, how many of these things that we think are human nature are actually some sort of enculturalization. Well, Chase has gone full anarchist on us.
Is that
but as I pointed out, his face is already on the recording, so we can still turn him in. Yeah. Well, we're out of time. Any final comments? Thank you to the few, the true, the dedicated. So,
I just want to say, burn everything.
Woo! Burn everything. We'll see how many people return next time, I assume, right? Well, things like
yeah. How many of us are in jail?
Yeah.
What's the guy, Tyler Durden? Is that? Or
yeah, from Fight Club. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's take it all down. Okay. Thanks again. See you next week.
Thank you very much.
All right. See ya.
Arrested.